Scipio let loose the majority of his troops against the inhabitants. Their orders were to exterminate every form of life they encountered, sparing no one. This practice is adopted to inspire terror. When cities are taken by the Romans, you may often see not only the corpses of human beings, but even dogs cut in half, and the dismembered limbs of other animals. A quote from Publius, describing the capture of New Carthage. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions podcast. This is the 19th episode of The Roman Empire, a podcast series about the history of ancient Rome. In this episode, we will focus, for the most part, on the war in Spain and the exploits and the personality of a single individual, Publius Cornelius Scipio the Younger, or as he would become known to history, Scipio Africanus. This Roman hero, whose first combat exploit at the age of 18 was to save his own father from a Carthaginian cavalry attack, would go on to become the youngest and least experienced man to ever command an entire theater of war for the Romans. When he had not even ever been elected to high office, in his mid-20s, he was sent to save the faltering Roman forces in Spain. For many in the Roman Senate, Spain was simply an important flank in the now global conflict against Carthage. Scipio would turn it into a training ground where he would learn how to vanquish the Carthaginians. And after he had earned fame here as a battlefield general, he would turn that fame into a political career and, as consul of Rome, invade Africa to quell the Carthaginian threat once and for all. But before we turn to Scipio's war in Spain, let me remind you to head over to the website, western-traditions.org. That's western-traditions.org, where you can find all the episodes. You can also check out the merchandise page where I sell some t-shirts, hats, mugs, and other items. If you want to support the podcast directly, consider the PayPal or Patreon buttons at the bottom right of the homepage. Patreon supporters get access to the Patreon page where I post updates and behind-the-scenes information about the podcast. I also publish the episodes there first, along with the occasional essay or link to a valuable history resource that I come across. Now, though, let's increase our focus on the Second Punic War. Our focus up until now has been quite general, roaming from east to west, from north to south, from one theater of the war to another. But now, let's specifically look at the war in Spain after the setback of 212 BC, and then later to the character of the man who would become known as Scipio Africanus. In 210 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the late general and Roman consul of the same name, arrived in Spain with reinforcements for the Roman forces there that were barely holding the line against the Carthaginians. And along with these extra legions, he also brought his command. He would be the man to lead Roman forces here, to fail or to prevail. Possibly not everyone at home was hoping that he would be successful. Rome was, as really all nations are in one way or another, led by two rival factions. The Fabian faction, named after its nominal head Fabius Maximus, was the more conservative faction, though this term conservative has little to do with the modern dichotomy between liberal and conservative parties in, say, the United States or rightist and leftist parties elsewhere. For our purposes, conservative indicates that Fabius and his followers preferred a more cautious approach to the war and a more Italian-centered focus. The goal of the conservatives was, as implied, to conserve Roman territory and to preserve Roman traditions, etc. The strongest political faction against the conservatives is now known as the Aemilianic-Scipionic faction, named after two powerful families in the Senate who had a more adventurous and ambitious nature. One of the men after whom we name this faction, Aemilius Paulus, was already dead in the war, though his family lived on. The Scipio family made up the other most powerful family in this faction. Its former leader was also dead, and now his son, Publius Cornelius Scipio the Younger, had been sent away to Spain, to a sideshow of the war. His earning of the command at such a young age had been a coup of sorts for his family's political faction, but the Fabians may have been glad to get this hero's son out of the way. He would be off in a theater of war where his loss would be beneficial to them, and his victory would still be beneficial to them, though hopefully without elevating his status too much. After all, how much could he hope to gain in Spain? I want to caution you, though, that this language that I've used, in my opinion, may overemphasize the vehemence of the factionalism in Rome. While there may have been petty politics involved among the Romans of these times, as we've already seen, the Roman patricians of the Senate did truly believe in the cause of Rome over and beyond their personal causes and the interests of their families. Hundreds of senators and their family members had already died on the field of battle. However much they may have been patricians and aristocrats, they were more than willing to slog into bloody combat alongside their plebeian countrymen and die at their sides. You can't say so much for our patricians of today. Most Western politicians have sold their honor and squandered the trust of their peoples in favor of foreign interests and personal gain. While members of the Roman aristocracy may have been as self-interested as any person, they were also committed to the welfare and prosperity of their people. The evidence of their dedication is buried in thousands of ancient combat graves across Italy and the rest of the Mediterranean. So I do not think that there was real ill will against Scipio. All Romans wanted all other Romans to succeed in battle, though they may have hoped that he would just toil manfully in Spain and leave the actual winning of the war to men, quote-unquote, better suited for leadership. Better suited because Scipio, while he was from an old patrician family with a long, glorious past, Scipio was also now the leading member of a faction that openly desired things contrary to those conservative values. They wanted to take risks. They wanted to bring Rome overseas to new lands. Many of the men in this faction were novus homos, new men, men whose families had only recently joined the ranks of the aristocrats, and they saw risks and adventures as the best way to advance their own personal causes. They wanted glory in combat to help them continue to advance politically, and they wanted Rome to expand her borders in more than just the old-fashioned territory grab of before, when Rome just expanded one small city or region at a time. The First Punic War, a few decades before, had suddenly thrust Rome onto the world stage and brought her armies and her trade into faraway places like Spain and Sicily. Ever since, she had continued to expand and encounter new peoples, new resources, and new ideas. The impact of this inflow of new wealth and new ideas into Rome will be discussed in a future episode. The Scipios and their followers were eager to not only win this Second Punic War, but to do so in a revolutionary fashion. The Fabians may have wanted a traditional battlefield victory followed by a peace treaty, concessions, maybe some mild territorial expansion, but their focus was Italy. Scipio and his followers wanted far-flung conquests, vast wealth, and the total subjugation of Carthage. They would get it. Scipio moved fast, but not foolishly. Arriving in Spain in 210 BC, he had already spent time learning about his father's defeat and about the Carthaginian advantages in combat. Like his soon-to-be nemesis, Hannibal, Scipio effectively gathered intelligence about his enemy before making a move, and he studied defeats and victories alike to learn how to do better next time. Publius tells us that Scipio was well aware that treachery had played a major role in his father's failure and his death, and that the division of the army into two smaller forces had also helped the Carthaginians win. In fact, he openly expressed that the Carthaginians could only beat Rome through such Roman strategic errors. The Romans, Scipio said, have never been beaten by the Carthaginians in a trial of valor. Yet, the battle plan that he announced to his army that year was not that different from his father's. The Carthaginian army, as winter turned into the spring of 209 BC, was once again, for the most part, camped in 3 separate locations spread across southern Spain. Scipio's plan, he announced, was to cross the Ebro River, with the majority of his troops, and to seek out one of these smaller Carthaginian forces, to destroy it completely, and then to have the upper hand in Spain in terms of troop totals, even if the remaining Carthaginian forces were able to unite. This is an old strategy, tried and true down through the years, which we will see replayed even in recent wars in history. When you're confronted by an army of equal or greater size, find a smaller portion of that enemy army, destroy it completely, and enjoy, after that, a new advantage in numbers. Scipio was just 27 years old that spring, as his army crossed the Ebro River and headed south into danger. And he was also lying through his teeth. He had no intention of once again trying to maneuver against and defeat 3 separate Carthaginian armies deep in enemy territory. Scipio's intelligence gathering the previous year had revealed a number of things, and that not only were the encamped Carthaginian armies far apart from one another and unable to support one another, they were also all far away from the local capital and primary port for their forces in Carthago Nova, or New Carthage, the city that we call Cartagena today in Spain. But Scipio had told only his best friend and second-in-command Gaius Laelius what his real intentions were. He was going to take his freshly reinforced and rested army, march down eastern Spain as quickly as possible, and seize New Carthage before the Carthaginians could react. His friend Laelius would bring the fleet down the coast as well and meet him there. The plan was a resounding success, but not just due to the speed of the Roman march. Though the city was only lightly garrisoned, the citizens of New Carthage had no intention of surrendering without a fight. Now, fortunately, Scipio had planned for this. His intelligence gathering prior to the operation had included investigations into the walls and battlements of New Carthage, as well as studies of the ocean's tidal patterns around that city. He encamped outside the city as his fleet appeared on the waters nearby, ensuring a blockade. Then he sent men with ladders to make a frontal assault on the walls of the city. When this apparently unimaginative attack was beaten off, he sent a new assault against a new, more lightly guarded section of the wall, but this effort was also held off by the valiant but tired defenders of the city. And then, as the day waned, the tide receded, and a new undefended section of wall became reachable if the Roman troops were willing to carry their ladders through shallow ocean waters and climb once more into battle. They were willing, for Scipio. He had counted on this tidal change and on his men's valor, and then those soldiers, they reached the top of the wall, and when they did, there was virtually no one there, because the defenders had already been stretched thin, and they were worn down, and it did not seem possible for anyone to enter the city from that direction. And so Scipio let his army loose among the townspeople. The Roman custom in these situations, when a city had refused surrender, was almost always the same: total annihilation. Every living thing was to be destroyed as a message to future enemies. Once, though, the commanders in the citadel of New Carthage offered official surrender, the slaughter was ordered to stop. And then the pillaging began. Among those pointedly spared during the plunder of New Carthage were the Iberian hostages that the Carthaginians had kept there. I have explained before how it was customary for powerful nations to keep quote-unquote hostages from their allied or subject nations. Publius, the historian who chronicled much of these wars and on whom I rely pretty heavily for my research, was himself a Greek hostage in Rome. But hostage does not normally mean, in these situations, someone tied up and suffering cruelly. Typically, such hostages were well fed and even entertained, but they were also closely watched. And thus, if the cities from which these hostages came ever betrayed the Allied cause, they could be executed in retaliation, and this tended to keep such betrayals from happening. Now, seizing these hostages in battle Scipio could do what he liked with them. They were, after all, from Iberian cities that were allied to Carthage. He could sell them into slavery, ransom them, kill them. He chose to free them and to send them home to their families. This was a calculated political move, and it worked. As the years passed, this was one of many gestures that would bring more and more locals into the Roman camp. At the last battle for the control of the peninsula in 206 BC, half the Roman army would be either Iberian or Spanish, and there would be no treachery this time. The locals had come to embrace Rome's presence. It didn't help that the Carthaginian cause that they had long treated the local Spanish with arrogance and contempt. But it seems like there was more to this story than just political maneuvering. Scipio was one of those men, like Hannibal, who simply possessed unique qualities. Some men in leadership positions excel not only due to their intelligence or to their bravery, but due to an ineffable charisma, certain qualities that make men want to follow them, want to take risks for them, that make men willing to suffer setbacks and even defeat and yet still follow their leader. That Scipio possessed these qualities, there is no doubt. Hannibal possessed them too. Scipio could be cruel. Every good leader must be willing and ready to be firm, even harsh, with his subordinates and with others at times. But poor leaders do not know how to rotate out of that temperament when necessary and to follow up with kindness, with mercy and friendship. Scipio was both feared and loved by those that followed him, and a military leader can ask for no better situation than to have men willing to follow him even to death. Armies composed of such men are almost impossible to defeat completely and for good. If they suffer a defeat, they rally around that leader and they listen for words of inspiration. If asked to march without food or rest, they muster in formation, ready to go. In combat, they are willing to try unorthodox tactics, and they're willing to take huge losses because they know that it is for the overall good and because their leader wants it so. Now, in control of New Carthage, Scipio still had a problem. 3 problems, actually. The Carthaginian Grand Army in Spain was still intact and outside his new city, even if it was divided into 3 forces. One of these was under Hasdrubal Barca, brother of Hannibal. Another was under Hasdrubal Gisgo, a long-serving Carthaginian general. And finally, another force was commanded by Mago Barca, Hannibal's youngest brother. Now, I will soon bring up the Battle of the Baecula, in which Scipio and his Roman troops faced off against Hasdrubal Barca, and his smaller army in 208 BC. But the question that may linger for you is, why were the Carthaginians chronically divided into armies of sizes inferior to the Romans? Initially, when we read Publius, it makes sense that the Carthaginians might be so separated at the very beginning of spring in 212 BC, when the elder Scipio attempted to catch them off guard and destroy one of these divisions while it was still in camp. It made sense to be divided like that because the meager resources available during winter might make it necessary to keep each army camp smaller in accordance with the supplies available in each region. But why was this consistently the case? And why was Scipio able to take advantage of it years after his father's death? It seems to invite disaster. It seems foolish. But then perhaps we should remember that so far the strategy of attacking one of these smaller forces had not really worked against the Carthaginians. When the older Scipio had tried to take advantage of this in 212 BC, it was the Carthaginians who had come out victorious. And when the younger Scipio had invaded in 209 BC, he had seized New Carthage not by defeating either one of the armies, but he had instead outperformed them all with speed and ingenuity, reaching New Carthage before they could react. So perhaps there was no need for the Carthaginians to change their strategies, since you could call Scipio's seizure of New Carthage little more than a fluke, which the Carthaginians, with their superior numbers and long-standing presence in Spain, felt certain to reverse at the soonest opportunity. But they never got that opportunity. Scipio marched rapidly out to find Hasdrubal Barca and his division of the Carthaginian army in spring of 208 BC, near the town of Baecula on the Baetis River. Scipio's army of 30,000 Romans and other Italians was now bolstered by an additional 10,000 local Iberians who had joined his cause. These troops met Hasdrubal's 30,000 mercenaries and allies and soundly defeated them. According to Publius, Scipio attempted something unusual here. He had most of his light troops attack the Carthaginian main body, while he and his second-in-command, Gaius Laelius, each led half of the heavy Roman legionaries around each flank and then crushed the enemy in between them. Hasdrubal escaped the battle, however, with a remnant of his army. He decided then, apparently having given the option some thought beforehand, that the situation in Spain could not be ultimately saved. The best bet lay with uniting with his brother Hannibal in Italy and making one last throw of the dice, attempting to defeat the Romans finally in their homeland. So instead of reuniting with the other Carthaginian elements in Spain, Hasdrubal led his troops north, toward the Pyrenees Mountains, and then toward Gaul, where he would recruit as much help as he could, and then invade Italy in search of his brother. We will come back to Hasdrubal Barca and his renegade army later in this episode. In the meantime, Scipio, instead of executing the Spanish prisoners that he had taken in the battle, he released them and sent them home, winning more hearts and minds in Spain. For some time, Scipio had occasionally heard Spaniards calling out to him when he passed on the road. They would shout out their word for king. Envoys sent from tribes seeking alliance with him would also address him as king occasionally. Now, when the cry of king became quite loud, even among his Spanish troops, Scipio did a very typical, cautious Roman thing. He gathered together the Spaniards, Publius tells us, and he told them that he did not mind being described as kingly, but he should not be called their king or anybody's king. Instead, he suggested that they simply call him imperator. This Latin word, imperator, simply means commander. It comes from the same root word for imperative in English, as in the imperative tense. This was the first recorded use of the word to describe a Roman general, but it would not be the last. Augustus, adopted son of Julius Caesar and descendant of a plebeian family, would take imperator as one of his titles after he took autocratic control of the Roman Republic in 27 BC. We now translate the word imperator as emperor. Now, Scipio was cautious with the title of king being thrown around him because hatred for monarchy was so ingrained in his truly Roman character, but he was very traditionally Roman in other ways as well. In future episodes, we will hear Roman statesmen and speakers lamenting, for instance, the fading religiosity of Romans after the Second Punic War. But we will not hear that said about Scipio. Like his political counterpart, Fabius Maximus, Publius Cornelius Scipio was very religious, at least outwardly. In the aftermath of his victory at New Carthage, he told people that it was the god Neptune who had revealed the ingenious plan for the assault, using the receding tide to assault an undefended portion of the city wall. The sea god had revealed it in a dream, he said. He also possessed the stubborn, tenacious, workmanlike resolve that characterized Romans, great and small, throughout history. Though his star was rising in Roman audiences after this great victory, he stayed on 2 more years in Spain, wanting to cement Roman control over the peninsula before he moved on to the next stage in his political and military career. At the Battle of Yipa, still in Spain in 206 BC, Scipio brought with him an army of nearly 50,000 troops. Half of them were Spanish Celts. Scipio's charisma was such that he could risk half his army being made of foreigners without fear of betrayals, like the one that had happened to his father and uncle. With another example of tactical brilliancy, this young Roman commander sent his light troops against the Carthaginians' 32 elephants and the center of the Carthaginian force, specifically with orders to enrage and upset those great animals with trumpets and dart-like javelin throws. The crazed elephants then rampaged chaotically among the enemy, while Scipio's heavy troops attacked them fiercely everywhere else. But at this point, perhaps all the Romans had to do was to show up. The Carthaginians and their allies, some locals, some from Africa and from Numidia, broke under the strain, and the demoralized army disintegrated. Carthaginian generals like Mago Barca and Hasdrubal Gisgo would manage to flee the battle. They took refuge in the last remaining Carthaginian stronghold at Gades, the modern city of Cadiz on the Atlantic coast of modern-day Spain. Now, the following year, though, the city of Gades would also fall to the Roman legions, but Scipio would not be there for the honors. He had his sights set now on an even greater victory, Sometime after the victory at Jippa in 206 BC, Scipio secretly sailed over to Africa, and there he met diplomatically with Syphax, the Numidian king who had been nominally allied with Rome since 213 BC. With the help of Roman military advisors, Syphax had been taking advantage of Carthaginian distraction by nibbling away at their mutual borders and fighting with other Numidians in Africa who were allied to Carthage. Later, Scipio came back across the waters to secretly meet in Spain with Massinissa, another Numidian warlord and a rival of Syphax. Massinissa had fought alongside the Carthaginians in Spain and against Scipio for years now. Now, eventually, these daring embassies to far-flung places would result in Massinissa coming over to the Romans to join the fight against Carthage. But Syphax, in Africa, conversely, would actually change sides again and join the Carthaginian war effort. In the meantime, the first anti-Roman uprisings began in Spain. The Romans may have promised to leave after their victory and to allow the Spanish tribes to return to their previous liberty, or perhaps the promise was unspoken, but it was certainly expected. Yet the Romans did not leave. They took control of the mines and they maintained their garrisons. And the Spanish began, as always happens in these situations, to regret replacing their old masters with new ones. And Scipio? Well, in 205 BC, he left Gaius Laelius in charge in Spain, along with Lucius Marcius Septimius, the knight who had taken over the army years ago after the disaster in which the elder Scipios had been killed. Scipio himself returned to Rome, where he intended to stand in the elections for the consulship of the following year. He was technically too young to serve as consul, being just 31 years old, but it didn't matter. The decision was unanimous. The young hero was elected, along with another ally of his by the name of Licinius Crassus. Not only was he elected, Scipio also got what he wanted. He had come into the election demanding that he be given a new theater of war. He didn't want to fight Hannibal in Italy and fritter away another year chasing the Carthaginian warlord around Bruttium or Apulia or wherever. Scipio wanted to invade Africa. Each Roman consul, you see, during war was assigned a province in which to act and rule. "Give me Africa as my province," he essentially told the Senate, "and I will end this war." So they gave him Africa as his consular province for the coming year, 204 BC. Africa, a land where not a single Roman legionary now stood. Not yet. As Scipio was waging war in Spain, the end was starting to look inevitable, with Rome slowly acquiring more and more control over a previously chaotic mess, though it would still be years until a peace treaty was signed. And Hannibal and his brothers and his compatriots still controlled large armies. Nevertheless, things were strategically getting better and better for Rome with each passing year. In 207 BC, Hasdrubal Barca, you remember him, he had fled Spain in an attempt to join forces with his brother Hannibal. He arrived in northern Italy with a ragtag army of survivors and barbarian allies. But his messengers to Hannibal in the south were intercepted, and he was defeated in battle near the Metaurus River. Seeing that it was all over, as the battle turned against him, Hasdrubal Barca charged directly into the Roman lines and died as bravely as he had lived. Great Roman names also left the battlefield during these years. In 208 BC, Marcus Claudius Marcellus had been elected consul for the 5th time, not counting the multiple times he had been left on the battlefield as proconsul. Marcellus had been the 3rd and last Roman to claim the triumph of the Spolia Opima decades before. He had served in the First Punic War and in numerous other engagements after that conflict. He had fought in this war valiantly also, and though he had long adhered to the Fabian doctrine of attrition warfare, he had been responsible for the return of Syracuse and many other cities to the Roman League. That year, Marcellus tracked and monitored Hannibal's movements, always looking for an advantage, of course, but never risking significant defeat on Italian soil. One day, though, and he was now in his 60s, Marcellus rode out on a reconnaissance mission with the other consul for that year, and they took just 200 horsemen as guards. The party was surprised by a much larger Carthaginian force. Marcellus, of course, never even thought of surrender. He died with a spear in his chest. The other consul died of his wounds the next day. Not for the first time, Rome had lost 2 consuls in the same year to combat. But Rome was also gaining more than territory. It was, as it had in the First Punic War, it was gaining experience and new tactics on the battlefield. A generation ago, the Romans had taught themselves to be sailors, and now their ships roamed the seas of the Western Mediterranean. And now they were learning how to articulate battlefield movements in a way that they had never done so before, and junior officers in the legions were making calculated decisions for the good of Rome. When Scipio ordered all these complex battlefield maneuvers, sending units left and right to flank the enemy, those successive waves of ladder troops at New Carthage, the combined operations of sea and land, he was doing something that Roman legions had not been able to do before. And new men, like his friend Gaius Laelius and Septimius, who had saved the Roman legions in Spain after disaster, these men, who were from lesser, sometimes even plebeian backgrounds, were showing that they knew how to operate alone, how to carry out orders and yet adapt to the unexpected on the battlefield, without waiting for orders from their aristocratic masters and wasting valuable time. Such men were going to be invaluable in finishing this war, because the goal for Scipio was not just to end Hannibal's invasion of Italy. He wanted to destroy Carthage. Almost as valuable, perhaps, as these young veterans were, was the wealth that now poured into Rome. Now, much wealth had been gained in earlier conflicts that century. Syracuse, for instance, when they conquered it, had opened doors of trade that helped to enrich Rome. But Spain was to bring wealth previously unimaginable into the Roman Republic. Gaining new trade routes meant slow, steady increases in prosperity, always a good thing. But gaining the silver mines of Spain meant a sudden and wild influx of money with a capital M, and that too would have its impact on Roman society. And this was perhaps what Fabius and his colleagues in the Senate had feared all along. Fabius Maximus, now in his 70s, was still at the head of his powerful faction in Rome, a conservative faction, a faction which wanted to free Italy, but only to return to something similar to the pre-war situation. It's not that the conservatives didn't want to defeat Carthage, but they feared the risks of overextending themselves militarily in overseas adventures, such as the invasion of Africa. And perhaps, without knowing it consciously, they feared what would come along with all the territory gained. New wealth, to be sure, but also new ideas, new peoples, and change. They feared that victory and conquest would change the way of life to which they had become accustomed, that Roman traditions would be affected. And here we find the heart of all conservative movements, the desire for things, however they are, to stay the same, to appreciate the devils that you know and to fear the ones that you don't. And they were right to be afraid. Fabius was right. Like Marcellus, Fabius would leave the war before its end, dying from an illness in 203 BC while Scipio was waging war in Africa. And in his dying, something of the old Rome would start to die as well. A new century was about to dawn, and amid its turbulence, Romans like Marcus Cato would later remember great Roman men like Fabius and all the others that came before him, and lament their loss. Scipio's glorious victory in Africa, which I will describe in the next episode, would make Rome master of the Western Mediterranean, but it would also be the beginning of the end of the old order of things. New wealth and new ideas, especially Greek ideas, would begin to flow into Roman circles. The next century in Rome would see the first uprisings against the political and cultural traditions of the Roman Republic, and the beginning of the chaos that would lead to Julius Caesar, to his assassination, and to the birth of the Roman Empire. After the insignificant battle in which the great Marcellus died in 208 BC, Hannibal searched the battlefield. He found Marcellus's body, and though the men had been enemies in war for a full decade now, Hannibal gave Marcellus a funeral and honored the man. The ashes he then sent across the battle lines to Marcellus's family. But perhaps it was more than Marcellus's body that went up in the smoke of that funeral pyre. Surely Hannibal could feel it. The war went on and on, the names changed, but the clang of sword and spear and shield just reverberated endlessly. Cities changed hands, allies came and went. If anything was changing for good, though, if anything was running out, going up in smoke, it was the sense of hope. Carthage had sent reinforcements to the lost cause in Spain, but had sent nothing to him. And as Hannibal stood over the body of Marcellus, somewhere off in Spain, Scipio was running circles around his helpless comrades. He would turn 40 in a year, Hannibal would. He hadn't seen Carthage in 3 decades. He had left Spain over 10 years ago. He had lost an eye and most of his original army, but he was still fighting the same war. A few years later, in 205 BC, when a younger Scipio was elected consul in Rome with a mandate to invade Africa, did Hannibal feel any sort of relief? He could never, in the years since he had invaded, he could never have decided on his own volition to give up, to go home. It would have meant dishonor and almost certain crucifixion. Neither he nor any of the Roman generals, not even the great Marcellus or even Fabius Maximus, no one had been able to defeat him or to find some other way to kick him out of Italy and to bring all this suffering to an end. Neither side could surrender. Maybe even stalwart Hannibal looked forward to someone doing something that would, for better or worse, bring an end to the war. Maybe he looked forward to Scipio's invasion. It was the only way he could go home.